Hello and welcome to another episode of Work 2.0, the podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Wells, and this is where we talk about AI, power, and the future of work. Today, sitting across from me virtually is none other than Professor Joshua Mask from Temple University. He recently produced an 80-page study on remote work, and you might call it the downsides of remote work. I mean, remote work is a very controversial topic. Years later, post-pandemic, we're still debating, is remote work a good thing or a bad thing, and to what degree, to what extent can it harm careers? And so he's here to discuss the findings of his study, what he's explored, isolating remote work from the pandemic, from the impact on AI that AI has had on jobs. And so I'm really delighted to have him with me to discuss this study. Welcome to the show, Joshua.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Brilliant. So let's get right into it. First off, if you just give me, for those of our listeners who probably don't have a clue what study we're talking about, might just give us a synopsis of what this study was about and what led you to embark on this study in the first place.
So the first, I would say, I've been interested in this topic, or broadly, I've been interested in trying to understand how the environment that you enter into when you first start your career, how that affects your wages, your employment, how things evolve over time. So that's just been part of my broader research agenda. In particular, I've looked a lot at how recession. So you start your career during a recession. That tends to harm your pay for decades. I mean, it can have a very, what we call, lasting scar. So just sort of trying to extend that research. And I remember reading, I guess, about some, emerging research that people were doing looking at AI, and some emerging research people were doing looking at the remote work, and just trying to, when I was reading about it, I was like, oh, the empirical design that I use in my other papers would actually work really well for this. I could actually this data that people have been using, I could use in mine and potentially find an effect. And I did. What I found broadly is that there is I wouldn't characterize it as a scar, because it does not last like a recession scar does. So when you enter into the labor market during a recession, so for every 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate that you face, so if you were normally going to go into a labor market that had a 3% unemployment rate, and now you're going into one that has a 4% unemployment rate, it can reduce your wages by 3%, and that can last into your 30s and 40s if you were starting your career in your 20s. So it's very long sort of scarring effect. Mm-hmm. I'm not seeing that with remote work or generative AI. What I'm finding is that with remote work, at least for occupations that are, it's to be more specific. So every occupation out there has a potential to be teleworkable. All right. So, and when the pandemic was happening, two researchers, Jonathan Dingwall and forget Naiman's first name, but they basically tried to look across the spectrum of jobs and say, okay, what is potentially able to be worked from home by via telephone or via video conferencing, and it's just the share of those jobs tasks that could be potentially remote workable. So that average across the population of jobs at the time is about 27.23%. So about 27% of jobs could be teleworkable, meaning that the task within those jobs, 27% of them on average could be done remote. So some jobs obviously could be 100% teleworkable, some could be 0%, but on average,
it's white collar, yeah.
So that's sort of the base, and I'm saying that a standard deviation increase in that, which is roughly for this would be about 20 percentage points. So going from 27% remote workable or teleworkable exposure to 50% is going to lead to 3% lower pay. And that is not a scar, because I only see it for about 2 or 3 years. Pretty much when a worker switches jobs or gets a promotion, the effect tends to go away.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, thank you for shedding light on that. So in terms of when we think about remote work, does your study distinguish between fully remote work and hybrid remote work, or are you grouping both together?
within an occupation, I could, if it's 100% teleworkable, you can infer that more of that job could potentially be done, remote, be a fully remote job, versus a job that maybe is 50% or 30% teleworkable would have to be some sort of hybrid arrangement. But I don't observe that. This is going to be based on pre-pandemic exposure. So we want to keep everything sort of frozen in place before the pandemic happens, because the pandemic is, it's like you're talking about the dosage before, and then you actually get the treatment during the pandemic. So we want to think about what the dosage is before we get the full treatment. And so I'm focused on, sorry, I'm gonna go back to the.
That's okay. That's okay. No, I wanted to know about between remote work and hybrid remote work.
So these occupation mixes, we could be able to infer from them, some jobs would be more likely to be remote and be fully remote. Some, if it's like a 50% exposure, maybe it'd be some sort of hybrid arrangement, but I don't actually observe that.
Right.
So it's inferred based on these occupation scores, but we don't actually see which ones are going to be fully remote versus hybrid. So I can't, give you a clean interpretation between those two.
That's fine. That's fine. And in terms of the drop in, we say 2-3 year drop in salary, did you notice that this was more pronounced depending on certain protected characteristics, like an individual's race, gender, parental status, their educational attainment? Did those things weigh in and change things a little bit?
So everything is using those as controls. So one of the things I want to do is I'm looking at the population as a whole, but I'm sort of trying to answer questions that are more individual based. So as much as I can, I want to take this population estimate and start to put it, weigh it based on the demographics of the population at large. So that is inherent to the design in terms of trying to divide the design up into those subcategories. I can do that. I don't get a whole lot of information from that. And the reason is that so the data I'm using is the current population survey. This is the same data that we use to calculate the unemployment rate every month. And the issue is that data looks at about 60,000 households every month. And then they look across those households. How do those households compare to the U.S. population at large when we do the census? And then we weigh those survey responses to those census sort of weights that we put together.
Right. Yeah, I understand.
And it allows you to take a small sample of 60,000 people and be able to get, population sort of estimates out of that. And I can look at these 60,000 people now, use these population weights, and get a sense of what that looks like, what that effect would look like for the entire country. When I try to start to break that down into categories, particularly race and gender, the issue, one of it is I'm not going to have enough individuals. So the ability for me to sort of infer an effect is going to be harder because the standard errors are much larger. So whether or not
that makes sense.
It's a significant or an interesting effect, I may not be able to really infer that. And I don't, when I split them up, I'm not really finding a significant difference. But I would say even beyond that, I don't think that this data is going to be able to get that granular for this type of question. I'm only looking at it because this is 60,000 for the entire population. I'm actually just looking at a portion of that. I'm looking at people that have just entered the labor market between the 2016 to 2026 time period. So it's like a subpopulation of that. And if I'm trying to subpopulation that into gender and race groups, I don't think that there's a lot of credible inference in that. So like population-wise, yes. Individual groups, no. But there is other research that does look at both gender and racial differences for remote work in particular. The AI literature is still sort of emerging, but in particular, Natalia Emanuel, Emma Harrington, and I think it's Amanda Pelias, they just recently published a study that looks at proximity to manager and how much feedback a junior gets. And they do find that female engineers do tend to get less feedback when they're working remote roles than men engineers. So, inferring from that, I think there probably is going to be more of a pronounced effect of these subgroups, but I'm not able to see it in my data.
That's quite enlightening. Thank you. So, what I want to know is, in terms of when we think about what exactly is causing this small 2-3 year distance, but it's a distance enough. Um, Obviously, with remote work, and we're isolating it from, the impacts of AI. And one of the things you notice in these studies that we often blame of job losses or the impacts on entry level work on AI, but you're saying a lot of this even before AI was started just because of remote work. What exactly is it about remote work that is causing these things to happen? Is it, you alluded just now to lack of proximity to management? Are there other things that are inherent to the nature of remote work that can slow down someone's career, reduce their pay for the short term and even for the long term?
Well, that's the question. Is this something, a choice that the worker's making? I'm going to get a little bit less pay for the amenity of work from home, or is this a permanent cut of productivity? And that's really the question that I'm trying to figure out is, are there productivity differences? Because those are going to be the things that would potentially be longer lasting. What I mean by productivity differences is there is definitely a lot, not just in my research, but in a lot of labor market research. The first few years of your career are very important, of socializing yourself to the profession, learning how to do things the right way, making mistakes so that you don't make them later.
Yeah.
And the question is, does remote work sort of make that more difficult? And worrying about junior workers in particular entering into that. The mechanisms, there could be a wide variety of them. Like I said, it could be a choice on the worker's part. We call that a compensating differential. One of the things I look at in the study is commuting times. If you're commuting 40, 50 minutes both ways to work, and you're paying for gas or for a train, and that may add up to the difference in pay that you're seeing. This 2%
Right.
you're seeing from my study. So it could be they're simply just making that that trade. There could also be this productivity difference. The question, the issue that I would say I have with my study is I cannot credibly if it is a productivity difference, I cannot credibly separate that from there being education loss for this cohort as well. All right. So what we're looking at is everybody that's entered the labor market post 2020. So cohort that entered in 2020, cohort that entered in 2021, 2022, 23. Everybody graduating in May-ish, and then going out and finding a job. And that those cohorts, they don't come in. It's not like they're all the same coming in, right? Like everybody, the cohort of 2020 is arguably different than the cohort of 2021, 2022. And one of those differences is probably education. And so I'm seeing it in my profession. It was very weird for the first few years that I was teaching at Temple, because I started in 2021. Every cohort that came through was missing something that I had to sort of reteach. And it was a lot of basic quantitative skills that students should have learned in their either sophomore, junior, or senior year of high school. Because the pandemic happened during that time, teachers tried the best, but a lot of them, for most of us, it was a year, that year was lost, in terms of education attainment. And so, I'm watching these students enter the labor markets. I'm seeing the ones that go into AI exposed fields, seeing a pay differential, seeing lower pay, because they are going into these jobs and being less productive. Is it because they're going into these jobs and making that trade? They're okay with doing that because they like the amenity of remote work? Or are we seeing something about their education? Is it what I'm actually picking up is that the 2020 cohort missed their senior year of college, the 2021 cohort missed their junior year of college, and so on and so forth. And you think about early career productivity, if I'd missed my sophomore year, I'm probably not going to be as good at my job as if I did well in my sophomore year. So I can't credibly pick up the difference there. What I'm seeing is that people going into these jobs are seeing a pay differential. Is that pay differential because they were coming in with less education to begin with? Like they had a degree in hand, but their actual education may be less than the cohort before them. right? And I can't separate that out. So I leave that as a potential mechanism, that it could be differential pandemic learning loss, it could be a compensating differential that's trading your commute cost for lower pay, or it could be remote work, and it could be a true, drop in productivity. And that's the third one's we're most concerned about. But
yeah, or it could be all three.
Yeah, all three are well, but the first one, if people want to make that trade, I think that's fine. It's like I made that trade as an academic, right? I'm choosing a career that will pay me. I mean, as an economist working for OpenAI or something, I don't know if I can get a job there, but an economist working in the tech industry, I can make 3 or 4 times as much as I can make as an academic. But I choose to be an academic because a lot of autonomy to my time, right? And so it's like I'm comfortable with that difference in pay because of that autonomy. And I think a lot of people might be the same way. 2% is not I mean, you're talking about $1,000 on a $50,000 a year salary to be able to pick your kids up on time. I mean, it's like I could think of a lot of people valuing that. So I don't know if it's necessarily, a bad thing.
Yeah. There was a FlexJob survey that I reported on last year for Forbes that mentioned that, I forgot the exact percentage, but basically I think it was close to 50% or 40% of people, respondents to their survey, said they would be willing to forego higher pay in favor of fully remote work. So and that was something that they'd be willing to they saw remote work as the top job perk, job benefit, more than insurance, health insurance, all the other well-being perks that a workplace could offer, higher pay, all that stuff. They would rather remote work, and they're willing to sacrifice everything else. So I can definitely see how that's probable. But when you think about, you raised a really important point about the sacrifice in career productivity that you observed even when you were teaching initially, like the students coming in 2020, 2021 who had missed part of their schooling because of the pandemic, and thinking about people, the class of 2025, 2026 today, who they haven't missed their education, but maybe they're starting their careers in industries or roles that simultaneously are fully remote or mostly remote, as well as being hit by AI, AI shrinking, entry-level jobs, as we know. So they're facing both of these things. And it's a very real problem that I discuss with CEOs all the time on this podcast. How do we create a pipeline for the graduating class of this year and next year and the year after, so that AI is not eating away their entry-level jobs, but it's actually kind of redesigning entry-level work and protecting the pipeline so that they can progress in their careers? What's your thoughts on that? Like, what should employers be doing right now responsibly?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, what was remarkable about this, when I first started this study, was just how much there was overlap between occupations that are potentially teleworkable and occupations that a lot of the tasks could be done with AI. And that's why I mean, a lot of this paper at the end, I'm making that argument that if you're looking at AI's effect on the labor market, you're going to have control for work from home because they're essentially the same job. So thinking about, the perils of work from home. Like I said, I don't know if it's I think, for the benefit that it brings people, I think that can be worth its weight in gold. So I don't know how to weigh that on an individual basis. But what I do truly worry about are people that are starting out their career, taking on more remote work. I don't know, or taking on a role that would potentially be like 100% remote. I worry about the sort of the gap in training, the gap in socialization, the gap in there's a lot of things you learn in the first few years that I worry that these students might be missing, but we don't have, none of the research yet has fully, been able to make that clear. But that's something that I do worry about for, I tell my students, I'm like, your first job, maybe, I think remote work's fine. I don't know if I would do that for your first job. But that's going to be increasingly so. And like I said, because these jobs overlap with AI, this probably will get turbocharged. Now, the fear is that people go to remote work because remote work jobs are also, a lot of their tasks can be automated by AI. Eventually, those remote workers just find themselves out of work. I don't know if that's true. I think that's very speculative. We don't truly know if AI is a substitute or a complement to work. What we're seeing right now is actually a lot more complementary. The famous prediction, I think it was a computer scientist, said that radiology jobs were going to be eliminated by AI and not go to radiology. And they're actually having a shortage now, and pay for that career has gone up like 20%. Because AI is complementary. People thought it was going to replace their roles, but it's complementary. So jury's still out on what AI is going to do to these jobs. I don't believe that a remote work job is just going to become an automated job. But I do worry about that choice for an entry-level worker because of the socialization, I would say, more than anything else. And I say that in part because of AI. Because AI, if it's going to do anything in terms of automating tasks, automating work, it's going to be the work that doesn't involve us interacting with one another.
Right.
It's like, I'm totally fine with AI dealing my expense reports. I would love for I get the receipts, I put them in a folder, I say, Codex, put it together and send it off to admin, and I never have to think about it again. And it's right, and it's done to all their specifications because it just does it, right? That's great.
Yeah.
What's not so great is me trying to land a sale, and I'm trying to land a sale by sending my client, my potential clients, a bunch of not thoroughly verified AI generated content that it's like that can be good or bad, but if it's not verified, if it's not, like, a lot of times it can be poor quality, and then it's like reflecting bad on the business. So there's going to be work is probably going to evolve more into our aspects of work, because if you think about humans and machines working together, our part in all of this is going to be more of the socialization, more of the interaction part. And so I think it's going to become more important to, like, your coworkers know who you are, your coworkers know you personally, they know things about you, like you feel comfortable around them, like. And I worry if you never interact with your employee or your coworkers in an environment. That, to be fair, some of that can be recreated in a virtual sense. But
then there's the nuances of the things that can't be planned in a Teams call or a Slack message that just happen in the office that you miss. And when you say socialization, I think some people may think, okay, well, I don't need to socialize, like, I'm cool, I'm an introvert, whatever. But we're talking about the skills that you build through that rubbing off on your co-workers or with your clients. So you're thinking about communication skills, you're thinking about even critical thinking, being able to adapt on the spot to emergency situations in the office, or relationship building, rapport building, all those things. And ultimately, I was talking to Dr. Ben Gretzel, who's the godfather of AGI, a few months ago, and he and someone else also said to me that the number one skill that's going to be needed the more AI takes over work is relationship building, really. So to your point, absolutely, if that's the number one skill, and then you're not getting the opportunity to develop that skill, then you're definitely setting yourself on the back foot there.
And I've been kind of framing this from the worker's perspective, because I'm thinking of my students when they're graduating. What advice am I giving them? But your question was more about the CEOs. What do they need to be thinking about in terms of improving this pipeline, keeping it durable long term? And the first thing they should recognize is that you want a pipeline. In a former life, I was a recruiter. I guess that's what got me into labor economics. Yes, I'm very familiar with that world. Did it for about 5 years, and the finding people is hard. Just if you think that you can just 5 years from now find everybody you need to meet all of your goals, like, you're not being serious, because it's the labor market is not where it was in the 50, 60 years ago, where people stayed in a job for 30 years. But you do want to sort of create a culture and a pipeline where you can have a steady stream of talent, that's coming in, that's sort of replacing talent going out. And So yeah, you want to have a pipeline. First and foremost, do not be looking at AI going, "Hey, I can replace my whole business," because that's not what's going to happen. So establish a pipeline. It's like, all right, so if I have roles that are going to predominantly remote, and a lot of times it may be the applicants that drive that, right? It's like, I can't find anybody unless they work remote, right? And it's like, okay,
that's what they want.
So it's like, I got to make this role remote. So if that's the case, then you just want to be mindful about how that pipeline is built for that type of role. And I think you're going to be, I would say it's going to have to involve, if you want the socialization piece, it's going to have to involve some, not coming into the office necessarily, but some sort of where the employees get in the same room together, whether that's a retreat, whether that's but that aspect I think is important, not just for your employee culture, but also for the new workers, right? It's like, I have some experience with this. I'm actually my job here at Temple in the middle of the pandemic. My colleagues weren't here. Most of my colleagues were, they were teaching, everything was online, so everybody was at home, right? And so, my first experience here was largely remote. And the thing that I noticed more than anything else is that I didn't really feel comfortable here for about a year because I didn't know anybody, right? And it's a very different experience from every other job that I had. So that's me, my personal experience. But I do think CEOs need to think about that for their new workers. Like, are they entirely happy here if they don't have any sort of relationships with anyone? The other thing I would say beyond that is that you have to recognize there's going to be a gap in training feedback. So there needs to be tasks, either in the way that you are able to monitor those tasks, so that you can see whether they're doing a good job or not, so that you can give feedback that way, or build tasks around so there's more oversight with current, senior level employees. These are things that naturally occur in an office, right? The junior worker gets assigned something, they don't know what to do, so they go to the senior worker, and they just kind of sit at the desk and figure it out. That's probably being done somewhat, and then hey, I'm gonna Zoom you now, and we talk it through. But to the extent that you can design tasks for that job that are just for that goal, just for training, right? And not just for the bottom line. But my hope is that I'm putting some investment in this worker that's going to pay off in 2 years. The more you do that, the more you can make that pipeline just seem like a traditional pipeline. Think about how you socialize anyone into some new environment. What are going to be the most successful ways of doing that? To the extent you can apply that to the job and make that less about what's that worker's first year productivity. It doesn't matter as much as their second, third, or fourth year productivity when they know how to do their job.
Yeah. Well, see, the part we didn't know is that you had a background as a recruiter before, which gives you extra leverage for this study. So thank you for slipping that in there right at the end. Well, thank you so much for lending your time for Work 2.0, the podcast. And for those of you who are watching or listening to this episode, feel free to share this with your coworkers, share this with your manager, or share this with a graduate who is just entering the workforce after graduating in the summer. And feel free to not just like this podcast, but rate this episode, rate the podcast, and comment and share it, because the more you share, the more people we get to reach. And I'll see you in next week's episode of Work 2.0, the podcast.